All right, Rabosai, let's begin. Today's daf is Kuf Chaf Gimel. We have a mamish, I don't even have a word. That's how good it is. That's how good it is. So Kuf Chaf Gimel 123. Today we are picking up on Kuf Chaf Beis and with Beis 122b. Tan Rabbanon. Last two lines. So says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon. Lo seis lo pishnayim. So the Gemara says, Pishnayim ke'achad. Ata omer. Pishnayim ke'achad. Oh, excuse me. So let's go back. So the pasuk says over here, the Gemara quotes the pasuk by the double portion of the bechor. So the pasuk says, Pishnayim bechal asher yimatzi lo. So we'll say, so bechor gets a double portion. What the Gemara now asks is, how do we calculate that double portion? Pishnayim ke'achad ata omer. So the Gemara says, when we say Pishnayim, what does that mean? Does that mean double the portion of one of the other brothers? So the Gemara says, Pishnayim ke'achad, o eino ela Pishnayim b'chol hanechasim. So we'll say, so the Gemara asks a very interesting question. So we'll say, so for example, how do we view Pishnayim? Is Pishnayim that the oldest brother gets double what the other brothers get? Or is it that the oldest brother gets 2/3 of the estate? So I'll say, so for example, meaning if you could imagine, if it's two brothers, so when the first brother gets a double portion, he effectively gets 2/3 of the estate. So the shaila is that like the paradigm, that a Bechar's Pishnayim is 2/3 of the estate no matter how many brothers? Or do we say he just automatically gets one more portion than the other brothers? So I will say, so 2/3 of the estate, I understand, that's an easy calculation. How would you calculate one times more, twice as much as the other brothers? So both say it's a very simple way to do it. The Rashbam points out. Essentially, what you would do is you would take the number of brothers, and just add one more and divide up the estate. So, for example, as we'll see, if there are nine brothers, so instead of dividing up the estate 9 ways, you would divide up the estate 10 ways. And what you would do is you would just simply give Bechar portions 1 and 2, and divide up the remaining portions ultimately amongst the other 9 brothers. So that's the fundamental shaila in Pishnayim. Is it 2/3 of the estate, or is it just simply twice as much as the portion of the other brothers? So says the Gemara, V'dinu. So we can learn from Makav Chomer. Top of Kuf Chav Gimel. Chalko em echad, v'chalko em chamisha. So in other words, a Bechor gets a double portion, whether he has one other brother, or whether he has 5 other brothers. Ma chalko im echad, pishnayim ke'echad. So we'll say, just like when a brother goes, when there are just 2 brothers. So the oldest brother gets a double portion of the other brother. In other words, he gets twice as much as the other brother. So too, when he divides up with other 5 brothers, he's not getting 2/3 of the estate. Rather, he's just simply getting twice as much as the other brother. Or on the other hand, you could look at this from a different perspective. You could compare his inheritance from one brother with his inheritance from 5 brothers. How so? So I'll say, if you have 2 brothers, so what ends up happening is the oldest brother, the Bechar, ends up getting 2/3 of the estate, meaning his Pishnayim, his double portion, is 2/3 of the estate. Maybe that's the paradigm. Just as he gets 2/3 of the estate with only one other surviving brother, Af Chalko Imhei, so too when he divides up the estate with 5 other brothers, Pishnayim b'chol hanechasim. Ultimately, again, he should get 2/3 of the estate. So both say, so this is the fundamental shaila in Pishnayim. Is it just simply one more portion than the other brothers, or is it 2/3 of the estate? So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. Talmud Lomar, so therefore the pasuk says, V'haya b'yom hanchilo es banav. So we'll say, therefore the pasuk says, it will be on the day that a father goes ahead and gives over his estate to his sons. Referring, of course, ultimately again to the death of the father. So the Gemara picks up on this lashon over here and uses this idea of b'yom hanchilo es banav, which indicates, I will say, that the goal of the father is to convey his estate to his sons in as generous as a way of possible, generous of a fashion as possible. So the Gemara says, Ribsa haTorah ribsa nachala eitzel achin. So the Torah goes ahead and tries to give as much portion, as much nachala, as much inheritance to the other brothers. So we'll say, so what does this effectively mean to us? So look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Rib Senachla, second line from the top. So we'll say, if the goal of the Torah is to maximize the inheritance, not just by the Bechor, but by all of the brothers, then by definition that would mean that Pishnaim should not be 2/3 of the estate. Rather, Pishnaim should just be a double portion above and beyond the other brothers. So the Gemara says, Ha'in lecha ladun kilashna achron, ela kilashna rishon. Therefore, Abosai tells us that we don't go according to the second approach, which is Pishnaim b'chal and achasim, 2/3 of the estate. Rather, we go according to the first approach, which is Pishnaim, a double portion, meaning one portion more than the other brothers. Va'omer. Furthermore, again, we'll say the Gemara quotes a pasuk. Ubenei Ruvain bechor Yisrael, ki hu ha-bechor. We'll say the pasuk says in Divrei Hayamim, and the sons of Ruvain, the Bechor of Yisrael, the oldest son of Yaakov Avinu, ki hu ha-bechor, because he was the firstborn, ubechilelo yitzui aviv. And literally, again, I will say, when he profaned the offspring of his father, which I will say ultimately is a reference to the event where Reuven moves Yaakov Avinu's bed, Nitna bechorasa lipnei Yosef ben Yisrael. The bechora, the birthright was given to the sons of Yosef, the son of Yisrael. Velolis yachesh lebechora. And ultimately, again, says the pasuk, but not for Yosef to be reckoned as the Bechor. So I'll say, so the pasuk seems to be saying what? The pasuk seems to be saying that Yosef was given the Bechorah in terms of that he gets Pishnaim, he gets a double portion. Yosef's double portion is manifest in the fact that his two sons, Ephraim and Menashe, are considered to be like Shvatim. But in terms of the title Bechor, that title remains with Ruvain. So the Gemara says, Ve'omer, another pasuk, Ki Yehuda gavar be'achav, because Yehuda ultimately was strongest amongst his brothers, ulenagid mimenu, and ultimately was a leader amongst them. Va'bechora liyosef nemra, va'bechora liyosef, and ultimately again the firstborn status was given over to Yosef. So the Gemara remarks. So the Gemara says, Nemra bechora liyosef, v'nemra bechora lidoros. So ultimately again it says bechora liyosef for Yosef, and it's bechora lidoros, bechora for future generations. Ma bechora hamur liyosef pishnaim ke'echad. We'll say just like the bechora for Yosef, ultimately again, how is that reckoned? He got an extra portion above and beyond his brothers. That will say, what does that mean? What that means ultimately is Yosef's bechora. He doesn't get 2/3 of the call it Yerusha of Yaakov Avinu. Rather, again, literally, he gets one additional portion. That whereas he would have been considered one tribe, now he's going to be considered two tribes. Af bechor amur l'doros. When it comes to the Pishnaim, what we call bechor, the firstborn, the birthright for future generations, Pishnaim ke'echad. It's not 2/3 of the estate. Rather, it's one additional portion above and beyond the other brothers. Va'omer. We'll say another pasuk. The Gemara is going to ask why we need all of these pasukim. Va'omer. Va'ani nasati l'cha shchem echad al achecha. So we'll say, so the pasuk says, Yaakov Avinu says to Yosef, I have given you shchem echad al achecha. Shchem as an additional portion above and beyond your brothers. Asher lakachti miyad ha'emori becharbi ubekashti. That I took from the hands of the Amori, I will say, with my cherev, with my sword, ubekashti, and with my bow. So the Gemara just says parenthetically, Tichi becharbo bekashto lakach, did Yaakov Avinu conquer Shechem with his sword and with his bow? Valo kvar ne'emar, yet the pasuk says, Kilo bekashti aftach, becharbi lo so shi'eni. Yet the pasuk says, Rabbi Hossein Tehillim, I will not trust in my sword, I will not trust in my bow, and my sword will not provide me with salvation. Ella charbi zotfila kashti zubakasha. Rather, it says the Gemara, beautiful Gemara. Cherev Rabbosi refers to his tefillah. Keshes, the bow, refers to his bakasha, his supplications. So says the Gemara, Ma'ika Omer. So we'll say, why do I need all of these psukim? In other words, the Gemara seems to have already made the point. Remember again, what's our topic? Our topic over here, our question over here is, everyone knows is Pishnaim, Bechor gets a double portion. But we've now understood that there are two ways that one could measure that double portion. I could say double portion is 2/3 of the estate. But we'll say, where do you get double portion 2/3 of the estate? Because the paradigmatic case of two brothers, where firstborn is taking a double portion, will effectively make it into 2/3 of the estate. Maybe that becomes the paradigm. Pishnaim is 2/3 of the estate, or no, Pishnaim just means one extra portion. How do you go ahead and calculate one extra portion? Essentially, divide the estate by the number of sons plus one. Plus one. that effectively yields you an extra portion in the division of the estate. You give that extra portion to the Bechor, so the Bechor gets double the amount of every other brother. So it seems to be that now we've conclusively proven that it's option 2. A Bechor does not get 2/3 of the estate, rather a Bechor gets one extra portion. So the Gemara asks, why are you bringing down all of these psukim to bolster this idea? Mai va'omer. So I need all of this. The Gemara says, because the Gemara says, at first I would have thought that's what was being stated, bless you, is in accordance with the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. Remember again, we had Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka yesterday. What did Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka say? Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka said that a father could choose to go ahead and give all of his inheritance to one of his children, as long as what? As long as that child was in the correct line of inheritance. So if a father has a group of sons, he could choose to give all of the inheritance to one son. He has no sons but daughters, he could choose to give the inheritance to one daughter. But if there are sons and daughters, he could not go ahead and give the inheritance to one of his daughters. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, Tashma u'bnei Ruvain b'char Yisrael. Therefore, the pasuk says, therefore the Gemara brings down the pasuk of b'nei Ruvain b'char Yisrael. V'chitema b'chora mi b'chorasa lo garminon. Maybe you would say that you can't learn out Rabosai the din of b'chora. In other words, you can't learn out b'chora from b'chora. So because they're two separate words, to which the Gemara says Tashma da b'chora li Yosef. Therefore, the Gemara brings down another pasuk of using the word b'chora. V'chitema Yosef gufei mimayd pishnaim ke'achatava. Maybe you'll say that how can you Yosef serve as a paradigm for what pishnaim looks like? Maybe. How do you know that Yosef just had one more portion than his brothers? Tashma va'ani nasati l'choshchem echad alachecha. Because it will say even the lashon that Yaakov Avinu uses, I've given you Shechem echad alachecha. I've given you Shechem as one portion above and beyond your brothers. So Papa said to Abaye, Ema dikla ba'alma. So maybe when Yaakov Avinu gives Yosef Shechem, so maybe again, or he gives him the double portion, maybe he's just giving him one dekel. A dekel says a palm tree. In other words, how do you know that he's giving him a full additional measure? To which the Gemara says, Amar le alecha makra, Ephraim u'Menashe, Keruven v'Shimon yihiyuli. Because it will say, in the way that Yaakov Avinu says to Yosef, that Ephraim and Menashe will be like Reuven and Shimon, tells us what? That Yaakov Avinu intends for the Pishnaim of Yosef ultimately again to be an additional portion, just like the other tribes. So therefore I will say the Gemara comes to this conclusion. So how do we pass in halacha? It's a very important halacha. How do you pass with Pishnaim? In other words, how do we ultimately calculate the double portion of the Bechar? So ultimately again the Shulchan Aruch paskins, this is in Hilchos Nachalos, Simin Reish Ayin Zayin, HaBechar notal Pishnaim b'nichsei aviv. A Bechar goes out and takes a double portion in the property of his father. Ketzad hiniach chamisha banim ve'echar me'em Bechar. HaBechar notal shlish hamamon v'chol echar me'arba pshutim notal shesos. Shabbosai Shulchan Aruch paskins like the first lashon, namely again in the Sma actually comments on this. The Mehira Seinayim, he says this more explicitly. He writes, Perush lo teima shenotal b'shnayim b'chol echav kamakra v'aynu shafim meniach asher banim fine. So I'll just say it's outside. So halacha ma'aseh, the way we paskin is that Pishnaim is not 2/3 of the estate. The way we paskin ultimately is that Pishnaim means one additional portion of the estate. Therefore, again, father dies, leaves behind 5 sons. You would divide up the estate 6 ways, and the Bechor ultimately would take 2 of those portions. That's how we figure out Pishnaim. Good. Says the Gemara Baiter. Let's see how we're going to get to some beautiful, beautiful sugyas. Says the Gemara, Boy mini Rabbi Chelma Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. So ultimately, again, it asks Rabbi Chelma from Shmuel Bar Nachmani. Ma ra'a Yaakov shnata Bechora meruvein v'nasna li Yosef. So ultimately, why is it that Yaakov Avinu saw fit to take the birthright from Reuven and to give it to Yosef? So the Gemara says, Mara ubechilalo yitzui aviv ksiv. The pasuk says explicitly why Reuven lost the Bechorah, because again, literally he profaned his father's offspring, which again we understand to mean that he, Rashi HaKadosh points out, that he moved Yaakov Avinu's bed. So what's the pshat? Ela Mara shenasna li Yosef. So it's something else. I understand why Reuven lost the Bechorah. My question is, why was it given to Yosef? So I understand Reuven's behaviors caused him to forfeit the birthright. But why was it dafka transferred to Reuven? To which Rosh Bar Nachmani says, To Yosef, excuse me. Emshal l'cha mashal. I'll give you a mashal. So emshal l'cha mashal ma davar doma. Lebal habayis shegilo yasam b'soch beisam. This can be compared to a balabas who raised a yasam, who raised an orphan in his home. Liyamim hash asa yasam. So over time, right, as the yasam grew up, he became very wealthy. Va'omer ahaniu lebal habayis minechasai. So the yasam says, the orphan says, I want to benefit the balabas who raised me. In other words, the balabas gave me so much. I want to go ahead and give him back from my property. So we'll say, what's the nimshal over here? The nimshal over here is that Yosef provided for Yaakov all of the years that Yaakov Avinu was in Egypt. He provided not just for Yaakov, for the entire family. So because Yaakov Avinu has hakaras hatov to Yosef, that Yosef sustained the family during this incredible famine, therefore what? When it comes time to take the birthright away from from Ruvain, and give it to someone, ultimately Yaakov Avinu sees fit to give it to Yosef. So the Gemara says, Amarlei, so I understand, according to this logic, what if Ruvain had not sinned? And therefore not forfeited the Bechorah. So you're telling me again that Yaakov Avinu wouldn't have given Yosef anything? In other words, we'll say here's the problem. Using that logic, Yaakov Avinu would have stood ready to give Yosef something anyway, right? For Yosef's graciousness, for Yosef's hospitality, for Yosef's generosity. But there seems to be something much more targeted about Yaakov Avinu giving the Bechorah from Ruvain to Yosef. Why was that? To which Gemara says, Rabbi Yonasan Rabcha lo kachamar. But they said to him, did Rabbi Yonasan, your Rabbi, not say the following? Ru'uya haisa Bechorah latzeis miracham. We'll say in reality, the firstborn, right, the Bechorah, should have come from Rachel Imenu. Because we'll say at the end of the day, remember, first of all, Rachel, fine, we'll see it inside. Dichsiv, Eila toldos Yaakov Yosef. We'll say, because the Pasuk says, these are the offspring of Yaakov, Yosef. Now we'll say, the fact that the Torah records Yosef as the first offspring of Yaakov tells us that what? Yosef should have been the Bechor. Yosef should have been the Bechor. Ella, Shekadmasa Leah Berachamim, but Leah Imenu ultimately, literally, sounds like preceded Rachel with divine supplications. Umitoch tznius shahaisa ba berachel hechzira Kadosh Baruch Hu lo. And ultimately, because of the tznius, because of the modesty of Rachel Imenu, ultimately the Ribono Shel Olam went ahead and what? Returned the birthright to her. So we'll say, so now the Gemara says, what does all of this mean? So we'll say, so here's the Gemara suggesting. The Gemara is suggesting that ultimately, again, the Bechorah, when it's taken from Ruvain, ultimately is given to Yosef. Why? Because on a technical level, Yosef should have been the Bechor. As we'll discuss, Yosef should have been the Bechor, but ultimately Leah Imenu's supplications preceded Rachel. Therefore, Leah is given children first. But at the end of the day, the Bechorah makes its way back to the child of Rachel, to the firstborn of Rachel, to Yosef. So the Gemara is now going to unravel this narrative. What are we talking about? So, my kadmasa Leah berachmanim. What does it mean that Leah Imenu preempted Rachel with divine supplications? Dichsiv ve'ine Leah rakos. We'll say it's a beautiful Gemara. The pasuk says that the eyes of Leah were soft. My rakos were tender. My rakos. So we'll say, what does rakos mean? Ilema rakos mamash. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. The Gemara understands that tender eyes is not a compliment. Right? It understands that it's saying that her eyes are, when it says tender, more like puffy. Right? Again, not very attractive. So the Gemara says, why would the Torah tell us that Leah Imenu's eyes were not very attractive? Listen to this, we'll say, this is an incredible Gemara. Efshar beginus behema tamei lo diber akasav. Now we'll say, the Torah is careful with how it speaks about unkosher animals. Dichsiv, mina behema tahora, or mina behema shar einenu tahora. We'll say it's an incredible yisod. You know, when the Torah speaks about a non-kosher animal, the Torah doesn't say treif. The Torah doesn't say, disgusting. The Torah says that there's a behema that's tahora, and a behema that's not tahora. Right? That's tahora challenged. And I was about to say, so this is an incredible yisod, by the way, for how a person is supposed to seek. The Torah is telling us about being careful about the words that I use, and about specifically about the abrasiveness of one's language. So if the Ribono Shel Olam doesn't even call the unkosher animal treif, Instead, what does he call it? Habehima asher einenu tahora. Beginus tzadikim diber akasav. Torah is going to say something disparaging about Leah Imenu. Ela Amar Belazar, Shematnosea Arugos. Shematanosea Arugos. Rather, I will say, interestingly enough, the Gemara makes a little bit of a play on words. What does it mean, Eine Leah Rakos? It means Shematanosea, the great divine gifts that she was going to receive are long, are great, or are abundant. A reference to the idea that ultimately that which will come from Leah Imenu, the brachos that come from Leah Imenu, are great in nature. If you look at the Rashbam will say this is in the wide lines, 4 lines in Arukos, Gidolos, Bekahuna, Velevia, Jose, if you think about it again, Leah Imenu is the mother of all Jewish leadership. Right? She's the mother ultimately of Yehuda, which is monarchy. She's the mother of Levi, which is spiritual leadership, Kohanim and Leviim. Therefore, the Gemara makes a play on words, Einele Arakos, Shamatonosea Arukos. Literally, again, her gifts are long, meaning her gifts are great and abundant. Rav Amar, no. Liolam Rakos Mamish. It's not true. Soft, tender means soft and tender. Means, again, her eyes were not attractive. But however, Velo Genaihu, I will say this was not considered to be disparaging of her. Ela Shavachula, rather this was praise of her. How? Shaisa Shomasa Parshas Drachim, because Leah Imenu used to hear people talking on those. Parshas Drachim literally means like at the intersections. You know, she heard people, the places where people would congregate and shmooze. So she used to hear.
They weren't talking in shul, they were talking at the Basra.
Baruch Hashem, absolutely. It's a beautiful limud schus. Absolutely, correct. At least if they're talking Lashon Hara, it wasn't in shul. Absolutely. Parshas Drachim. So listen to this. So she heard Bnei Adam Shay Omrim Shnei Banim Yesh La Rivka Shnei Banos Yesh Lo Lavan, and she heard them saying the following. You know, Rivka has 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. Yaakov has 2 sons, Esav and Yaakov. So what happens? Yesh Lavan Gidola Lagadol Uktana Lakatan. So people assumed that Esav would marry Leah. Esav, the oldest of Yitzchak, would marry Leah, the oldest of Rivka, would marry the oldest of Lavan, and ultimately Yaakov, the younger one of Rivka and Yitzchak, would marry the younger child of Rachel of Lavan. So the Gemara says, "V'haisi Yoshevas Parshas Drachim u'mashelas." So Leah Imenu would always hear this. So from the time that she was young, she would always hear this talk that she was going to marry the oldest son of her aunt Rivka, and she asked, "U'mashelas." Godel Mama Asov. So she asked about, tell me who you obviously know about this guy, this oldest son of Rivka. Esav, tell me about him. People would say, Ish Rahu, he's one bad guy. Umalastem Librios. Literally, again, he hurts people, right? He hurts people. He abuses people. And then she would ask, Katan Mamasov, tell me about the younger son of Rivka. And people would say, Yaakov, Ish Tam Yoshev Olim. Ultimately, again, a simple man, dweller in tents of spirituality. Vahisabocha. So when Leah Imenu heard that this was her plight to ultimately marry this Rasha, she cried. And she cried, Achanishru Riseinel, until literally her eyelashes fell out. So we'll say ultimately again, this is Eine Leah Rakos. It's true. The Torah is telling us that she became somewhat unattractive, but the Gemara is not telling us, the Gemara not telling us against something negative about her, but rather telling us her incredible righteousness. The notion that she was going to marry someone who was not holy, the notion that she was going to marry someone who was wicked, caused her constant pain. So the Gemara says, V'hainu dichsiv, Vayar Hashem kisnu aleya. This is ultimately the meaning of the pasuk that says that the Ribono Shalom saw that Leah was despised. Ma'isnua. What does that mean that Leah was despised? Ile masnua mamish. If you want to say that literally Yaakov Avinu despised her, so how could that be? Again, Efshar bignus peimat me'alo diber akasuv, bignus tzadikim diber akasuv. Also, as you said before, the Torah doesn't even speak disparagingly about animals. The Torah is going to speak disparagingly about tzadikim. Rather, I will say what it means is the following. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Rather, what it means is the following. That, what does it mean? Vayar Hashem kisnua Leah. That the Ribono Shel Olam saw that the actions and the lifestyle of Esav was despised by Leah. That what Leah wanted more than anything, Rabbi say, in life was a life of righteousness, a life of holiness. Therefore, as a result, Vayiftach es Rachma. Ultimately, again, the Ribono Shel Olam allows her not only to marry Yaakov Avinu, but ultimately gives her children first. Because I will say, by giving Leah children first, what that does is it solidifies her relationship with Yaakov Avinu. It solidifies her marriage. Even if she is not the most beloved wife, at the end of the day, because she has children, now her place is secure. Why is she given the privilege of having her place secured initially? Because it was she's so yearned and she's so pined for that life of holiness with Yaakov Avinu. Umay tznius haisa b'Rachel. We'll say, what was the modesty of Rachel Imena that we discussed before? So the Gemara says, "Dichsev vayagid" is amazing. Vayagid Yaakov l'Rachel ki achi avihu. Because once when Yaakov introduced himself to Rachel, he says that he is the brother of her father. V'chi ben Rivko, v'alo ben achos avihu. So 1 second. So the Gemara says, what does it mean when Yaakov Avinu says to Rachel that he is the brother of her father? He's not the brother of her father. He's the son of Rivka. In other words, he's the son. Meaning, he's ultimately her cousin. He's not the brother of her father. To which the Gemara says, Ella Amrla min sabasli. In other words, the Gemara says something amazing. Yaakov Avinu goes in and says to Rachel, marry me. Amrla in. She says, yes. Mihu Abba Ramahu v'lo yachlasei. So this is amazing. So Rachel says, yes, but I have to tell you, my father is a real Ramai. My father is a very underhanded, sneaky individual. And below Yachlas, I'm just telling you, you're not going to be able to best him. In other words, there's no way you'll be able to overcome. So I'm just telling you, I'm happy to marry you, but I don't know what he's going to try to pull. Amrle, Myra Musei. So Yaakov Avinu says, like what? What do you think he's going to try to pull? Amrle isti achsag kashisha minai v'lo minsa bali mikama. So Rachel says, I have an older sister Leah, and I know that my father will not marry me off before she is married off. Amrle, to which Yaakov says, don't worry, achiv ani beramos. I could be just as sly as your father. Right? I could be just as much as, that's what it means when it says, Ki achi aviyahu. I am the father, that he told that he was the brother of her father. Meaning, in other words, if your father is going to be underhanded, I can be underhanded as that. So we'll say this is amazing. Amrlei, umishari lehu litzadiki lisagui baramusa. So we'll say ultimately again, but Rachel Imenu says, but is it permitted for a person to be so underhanded? Is it permitted for a tzaddik? I will say, by the way, herein lies such an incredible distinction ultimately between men and women as well. Men have an incredible way of the ends justifying the means, right? That as long as ultimately the goal is noble, I can employ a whole bunch of different approaches. So again, the Bini Yisera ben Nashim understands that if you have to employ negative circumstances or negative mechanisms in order to actualize your result, it's not good. It's not good. So again, Yaakov Avinu says, "Don't worry, I got this." To which Rachel Imenu says, "Really, like." Are you sure, because you're a righteous individual, are you sure it's appropriate for you to act this way? Amar Allah, to which the Gemara says, Yaakov Avinu says in. Yaakov Avinu says yes, sometimes you have to be underhanded. He quotes the pasuk. I will say, obviously, he's not, whatever this means that he's quoting this pasuk from Shmuel, Im navar tetabar vim ikesh tispalal. Titafal, With an honest person, you should be honest, and with a crooked person, Rabosa, you should try to be a bit sly. In other words, the Navi is saying that ultimately, sometimes, depending on who you're dealing with, you have to employ different kinds of behaviors. So what happens? In an effort to make sure that Lavan can't switch Rachel with Leah, Masrala Simonin. He gave Rachel some type of signs, whatever the signs were, so that she'd be able to identify herself to him at the chuppah. Ki kama aili la lileh. So she will say, sure enough, Rachel Aminu was right. And Laban tries to substitute Leah for Rachel at the chuppah. Savris, so what happens? Leah is being taken to the chuppah. Savra, hashta michsafa achsoi. So Rachel Aminu says, my sister's going to be embarrassed, because now what's going to happen? She's going to get to the chuppah, the signs won't be there, and what's going to occur? she's going to be outed. So Masrasinu Nihile. So we'll say, so again, Rachel Imenu gives Leah the signs. V'hainu dichsiv, and therefore again she's able to pass herself off as Rachel. V'hainu dichsiv, v'hi baboker, v'hine hi Leah. That's why the pasuk says, Rabbi said that in the morning, when it was light, ultimately Yaakov Avinu saw that it was Leah. Michlal dad hashta lav Leah. So what does that mean? Until now it wasn't Leah. El mitoch simon and shemasar lo Yaakov l'Rachel umasarta l'Leah lo havayada lo ad hahi shaita. So Rabbi said ultimately again because Rachel Imenu gave the signs over to Leah. Ultimately, again, Leah was able to pass herself off as Rachel, and it wasn't until the next morning that Yaakov Avinu had discovered that in fact he was married to Leah Imenu. So we'll say, so this was the incredible tznius, the incredible modesty, ultimately of Rachel Imenu not wanting her sister to be embarrassed. Abba Khalifa, Kruya Mirabchia Bar Abba. So we'll say, so the Abba, this is actually Abba Khalifa. We'll say Kruya is the name of his place from Chia Bar Abba. Bichlalan atamotzi shivim. So we'll say, so again, so just so you understand how this whole thing kind of wraps together. So we'll say, so therefore the Gemara suggests the following. So therefore the Bechorah should have come from Rachel. Why should the Bechorah have come from Rachel? Because ultimately, again, Rachel Imenu was the one who was supposed to marry Yaakov first. Because of the incredible tznius, because of the incredible modesty of Rachel Imenu, that she did not want her sister to be embarrassed, she gives the signs. Leah is married first. Because ultimately, again, of the intensity of Leah to be married to a tzaddik and to live a life of kedusha, she is blessed with children first. But because of the incredible mesiras nefesh of Rachel Imenu, so ultimately the Bechorah comes back to her later on through Reuven's mistake, and ultimately at that point in time the transfer of the Bechorah back to Yosef, the firstborn of Rachel Imenu. An incredible story. So the Gemara says the following: Abba Khalifa Kruya Mirabchia Bar Abba Bichlalana Atamotzi Shivim Bipratan Atamotzi Shivim Chaser Echad. So we'll say, Torah tells us that there are 70 people who came down to Mitzrayim, but yet when we count it out, we only find 69. Amrle to Umahaysen Dina. There was a twin who was born with Dina. Dichse Vez Dina Bito. Because we'll say the extra, the VS, and Dina, his daughter. S is a riboy. S usually comes to include something additional. Therefore, again, we see that there was a twin who was born with Dina. That's the full 70. Elame'ata to Umahaisa in Binyamin. But one second, using that logic, we'll say, then there must have been a twin that was born with Binyamin as well. After all, what does it say? Dichsev, we'll say Amud Beis. Dichsev ve'es Binyamin achiv ben imo. It says ve'es by Binyamin as well. So does that mean that there was a twin by Binyamin? To which the Gemara says, Amar, Margalis Tova Haisibiyadi. So he said to him, I had a beautiful stone, a beautiful jewel in my possession. Va'ata ma'akesh la'abda mimena. In other words, I have an answer, but I didn't really want to give you the answer. They both say, why did he want to give me the answer? Take a look at the Rashbam. Margalis Tova, top line. Ta'am ya'akar be'enai ki margalis shala yisirot salagalos umeikar lechadudehu deboy. So let's say, here's an amazing thing. Sometimes you see this in the Gemara, that a Talmud would ask a Rebbe a question, and the Rebbe Dafka would not want to answer it. Why? Because he wanted the Talmud to try to figure it out on his own. So he says, I have an answer for you. I didn't want to give it to you because I wanted you to figure it out, but now that you're not figuring it out, I'm going to tell you the answer. Haki Amr Rabbi Chanina. We'll say Kuf Chof Gimel Amud Beis, third line down. Rabbi Chanina said, Zu Yocheved. We'll say who was the 70th person who was part of the group of the 70. Because actually also we just learned this yesterday. This was Yocheved, Sharasa, or 2 days ago, Sharasa B'derech V'leidasa Ben Achomos, who was conceived on the way down to Egypt. Right? And ultimately, again, it was born ultimately, again, as they entered into the walls. Shne'emar Asher Yalda Osa LeLevi b'Mitzrayim, who was, when talking about Yocheved, it tells us she was born to Levi in Egypt. Leidasa b'Mitzrayim, vein Horasa b'Mitzrayim. Her birth was in Egypt, but conception was outside of Egypt. Fine. Ba'amini Rabbi Chalmon b'Reb Shomar Nachmani, Ksiv, Vahikasher Yalda Rachel Es Yosef. So it says the Gemara, the pasuk says, and it was when Rachel gave birth to Yosef. So the rest of the pasuk is, Vayomer Yaakov Alavan Shalchini ve'elcha mikomi la'artzi. So the pasuk says, and it was when Rachel gave birth to Yosef. Yosef approaches Lavan and says, "It's time for me to go home." So asks the Gemara, Maishna kiyas yalid Yosef. So we'll say, meaning the pasuk seems to say that it was dafka only after the birth of Yosef that Yaakov felt that it was time to go home. Why? Why was it? What was it about the birth of Yosef that said to Yaakov, it's time to journey back to Eretz Yisrael? So Amalei Ra, so Gemara says, Kiyas Yalid Yosef. Amalei Ra Yaakov Avinu Shein Zaro Shal Esav Nimsar Ela Biyad Zaro Shal Yosef. Because what Yaakov Avinu saw prophetically that the offspring of Esav, which Rabbi say is a specific reference to Amalek, that Amalek would only be vanquished by the offspring of Yosef. That Yosef had a special koach to conquer Esav. Shneimar V'haya Beis Yaakov Ish. The house of Yaakov will be fire. Ubeis Yosef lahava, but Yosef will be the flame. Ubeis Esav lekash, and the house of Esav ultimately will be straw. So we'll say, so without the flame, the fire can't consume, and therefore again Yosef HaTzadik was the flame. So apparently again what the Gemara is saying over here is something amazing. That it was only after the birth of Yosef that Yaakov Avinu felt his family was armed with the requisite merit to go back to Eretz Yisrael and to face any enemy, including Esau. In other words, Yaakov Avinu, interesting enough, Yaakov Avinu knows deep down that probably Esau is going to find him. And he does not know exactly what Esau's intentions were. So the Pasuk indicates that it was only once he had Yosef that he felt armed with the necessary zuchus to go out and face this enemy, or this potential enemy. So Esvei, the Gemara asks the Kasha, Vayakom David me'aneshev ad erev l'macharasam. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. The pasuk over here is discussing David HaMelech's war with Amalek. And ultimately, again, discusses the fact that David HaMelech was able to successfully beat back Amalek. So we'll say, so what do you see over here? You see David HaMelech successfully vanquishing Amalek. So why is this a kasha, we'll say? Because we just got finished saying, who is the only one who has the supposed to be able to vanquish Amalek? Yosef. Yet here you see David HaMelech, who's from Shevet Yehuda, is successfully vanquishing Amalek. To which the Gemara says, Amalek, Dak, listen to this, we'll say. So he asked this question. So remember, this is a conversation. This is Rabbi Chelbo is asking from Shmuel Bar Nachmani. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani goes ahead and answers. Rabbi Chelbo asks another question from this pasuk of David HaMelech. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani responds. It's Rabbi Chelbo. Listen, me, Amalek, Dakariach Nevi, whoever taught you Navi, Lo Akariach Ksuvi, has not taught you Ksuvim. In other words, he's saying you should have paid a little bit more attention in Shir. Dichse, because the pasuk says, Belechto el Tziklog, Naflu Allah Miminasha. Because the pasuk quotes over here, the pasuk on Divrei Yavim. That when David HaMelech went to Tziklog to assemble his army, who joined David HaMelech's army? Naflu Allah Miminasha, Adna v'Yozeved v'Yidoel u'Michael v'Yozavad v'Elihu v'Tzilsei Rosh Elaf Asher leMenashe. So we'll say, so what does the pasuk say? The pasuk explicitly says who joined David HaMelech's army? The most valiant warriors from Menashe. Menashe, of course, is the offspring of Yosef. So you see from here that David HaMelech was only successful. Why, Abosai? Because again, the valiant warriors of Yosef were with him in his battle. Masiv Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef phrases a kasha. Umehen b'nei Shimon hochu lahar seir anoshim chamesh meos. Now the pasuk is quoting from Divrei Yavim again, and amongst them were the men of Shimon who went to Har Seir, right? Went to do battle with Seir, and who were they? 500 men. Palatya, Naariya, Refaya, Uziel, b'nei Yishai b'rosham. So we'll say, so again, the pasuk says, Vayuku asherus hapleita la'amalek, Vayesh v'sham adayom hazeh. They wiped out the remnant of Amalek. Obviously not full of Amalek, but a good part of Amalek. So I'll say, so again, who do you see over here? You see B'nai Shimon wiping out Amalek, which is not B'nai Yosef. To which the Gemara says, Amar Bar Shila, Yishi mibnei Menashe asi. We'll say Yishi was one of the warriors listed in the pasuk was the offspring of Menashe. Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, Ubenei Menashe Cheper v'Yishi. So we'll say ultimately again you see that in every successful war with Amalek, who is there, Abosai? The offspring of Yosef. Without the offspring of Yosef, we cannot fight a successful battle against Amalek. Good. Well, so now we get back a little bit to regular halacha. Not regular halacha, exciting halacha. But again, halacha sabachor. Turn Rabbanon. So we'll say, watch this. Fascinating brisa. Habachor not opishnayim. A bachor takes double portion. Bizroa ubelichayim ubekeva. So we'll say it's the following situation. This is talking about a Kohen. We'll call him Aaron a Kohen. And what happens? Aaron dies. And let's say in Aaron's possession are some of the Kohanic gifts. So we'll say when you go ahead and you offer up an animal, so the halach is you give to the Kohen the zroa, which is the foreleg, the lechaim, which is the jaw, and the keva, which is the stomach. These are kohanic gifts that a Kohen gets from an animal that's shechted. So we'll say, let's say the Kohen dies before he gets a chance to consume these items. So the Gemara says this passes down as a Yerusha to his sons. And if he has a Bachar, the Bachar gets Pishnaim in these items as well. Ubimukdoshin, Rabbi says similarly again in consecrated items, and again we're going to define ultimately what this means. Bimukdoshin, if the Kohen left behind consecrated items, the Bachar, first wide line, the Bachar gets Pishnaim in that. Ubishavach sheshavchu nechasav la'achar misasavin. And Rabbi say, interestingly enough, any appreciation that occurs within what we'll call estate property, the Bachar gets Pishnaim of that as well. But what the Gemara seems to be saying is the following: that the value of the value of the estate is not locked in at the time of death. In other words, should there be some type of appreciation after the death of the father, before the division of the estate, so the Bachar shares in that appreciation. He'll still get Pishnaim in that appreciation as well. We're going to discuss all these cases. So Ketzar. So we'll say, let's deal with Ketzar. What's the case? If the father left behind a cow, and the cow was in muchraches, so we'll say muchraches ultimately means it was a rental agreement, or I should say a lease agreement, where there's not a flat fee for the lease. Rather, again, the owner of the cow and the person who's renting it agreed to share the profits. Or muskeres, I will say ultimately means the cow was leased out. Or ultimately, again, the cow was a free-range cow and was just grazing out. The Yolda. And I will say, listen to this. Let's say, but after the death of the father, but before the division of the estate, what happens? The cow that was either leased out, rented out, or was just grazing gives birth. So I'll say, so the status is, the question is, does the Bachar have the right to share in that offspring, that new offspring? What's the halacha? Bechar nota pishnaim. I will say ultimately again the Bechar gets a double portion in that offspring as well. On the flip side of Bosai, aval banu batim benatu karim. If let's say again after the death of the father, but before the division of the estate, the other brothers go ahead and build homes on the estate or plant vineyards. Ein Bechar notel shpishnaim. The Bechar Bosai does not get a double portion. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. What is the Gemara saying? What the Gemara is interesting that Rashbam explains this is, if the estate property appreciates on its own after the death of the father, so the Bechar goes ahead and shares in that appreciation. So the simple example of that is, the father leaves behind the cow gives birth. Now the Gemara is very specific in its example over here, namely, that the cow is in the hands of someone else. So it's rented out, it's leased out, or it's free range. So none of the brothers are actively tending to the cow. The appreciation is what we call memela. It happens on its own. Therefore, the Bechar shares pishnayim. But however, if estate improvements occur through the efforts of the other brothers, the example is, they build a house that they're going to rent on the estate, or they go ahead and they plan. Although we'll discuss about the permissibility of building on estate property before the division of the estate. We'll get into that. Or they go ahead and they improve vineyards that are there. So we'll say in those cases, Lamaisa, where the appreciation or improvement in the estate ultimately comes about because of the efforts of the other brothers, the Bechar does not get Pishnaim in that. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, asks the Gemara, I don't understand. So we'll say, we're going to explore that concept a bit more because that's a very profound yisod. So now the Gemara jumps back for just a second. We said if the father is a Kohen and he dies, and he left behind in his estate Kohanic gifts of Zroa, Lechayim, and Keva. The foreleg, the jaw, the stomach. So the Bechar gets Pishnaim in that. So which the Gemara says, well, what's the case? Heichidami. So we'll say, if the father already had in his possession at the time of his death, then what? Then Lamais, again, it's obvious that the Bechar gets Pishnayim. And if the father doesn't yet have it, then what? It's Roihu. I will say it's right. I mean, it's an entitlement. But as an entitlement, ultimately, again, he doesn't get anything. And I will say, we've established many times, a Bechar only gets that which the estate owns, not that which the estate is owed. So what's the case of where he gets the Zroa Lechaim of the father? Hacha b'makire kahuna askinon. I will say this is amazing. This is where you have a situation where the father was a Kohen. And both say Makir Kuna means both say that it was common for Yisrael families to have very close relationships with certain Kohanic families, where there was understanding that what? that any Kohanic gifts that I get, I'm giving to you. Right? Any Kohanic gifts that I get, I'm giving to... I'm close to the Aaron HaKohen, he's my neighbor. Right? So anything that I get, I give to you. So what's the idea? So therefore, again, udishtachit b'chaye davun. We'll say, so the case over here is where what? Let's say again, the neighbors, Yisrael neighbor, we'll call him Yisrael, shechted an animal while Aaron HaKohen was still alive. So we'll say, so it was understood that what was going to happen, there was going to be these Kohanic gifts of the foreleg, the jaw, and the stomach. And again, the way it always worked is Yisrael always gave his Kohanic gifts to Aaron HaKohen. So we'll say, so the animal was shechted during the lifetime of Aaron, before Aaron died, but then Aaron dies before he could actually get the gifts. V'kasavar, matanos shelo hormu, kemi shehormu damu. So we'll say ultimately again, it teaches us, we'll stop over here, but the idea the Gemara is teaching us is that Lamaisa, even Kohanic gifts that have not yet been separated are considered as if they are separated in the case of Makirei Kuna. So we'll say it's actually a very specific case. So the case over here is where Aaron HaKohen lives next door, and again, it doesn't have to be living next door, but you understand, to Yisrael, his neighbor, Yisrael always gives him his Matnos Kahuna. This is what we call again Makirei Kahuna. Therefore, what the Gemara is saying over here is the following. As long as that animal was shechted during the lifetime of Aaron, it's as if what? Those Kohanic gifts were separated and given to Aaron, so that when Aaron dies, his Bechor gets Pishtayim in those Kohanic gifts, because those Kohanic gifts are not considered to be Roi, rather considered to ultimately be Muchsak. Alright, so we'll stop over here. We'll pick up here Hashem tomorrow.